Osu is a game which was developed by one guy in 2007 to emulate a Japanese DS game which only sold 120,000 copies. It now has over 15 million players, meaning that somehow it turned an obscure DS game into one of the biggest rhythm games in the world. How did it all happen? And how did the game evolve along the way? This is the evolution of Osu. We start all the way back in 2007, which was the year Osu was created, and at the time, it was a bit of a mess. The editor was borderline unusable, the rank section is barren in comparison to today, despite almost every map being rankable. Rank was done off score, star rating was completely busted, Taiko was a mod for standard and all the other modes didn't exist, and overall it lacked pretty much everything that makes the game what it is today. But although all these things seem fairly essential now, it did what it wanted, because although it's grown hugely out of proportion, the original goal of Osu was to emulate Elite Beat agents for the DS. And it did that well enough. You could make custom maps and there was a place to download them, and that was really all it needed to fulfill its goal. But obviously, it wouldn't stay put in this state for long. There are a few things to know between 2007 and 2009. First, the other game modes were implemented, but they were almost all converted maps until a good time after. At the start of 2009, the US was the country with the most players, with 9,000. For comparison, today there are 1.8 million in the US. There are only 4,800 maps ranked, compared to the 60,000 or so that are out today. The score rankings have also started to create trouble, with maps that give too much score being put in the approved category, which functions a lot like Love does today with PP. By this time, the game had already developed a culture with a lot of anime, but it still seems that there is a bit less than now. Tag 4 maps are also commonplace because there are still a fair few people who actually play the mode. The main thing that would happen in 2009 though would be the growth of the game, because the highest player count went from the US with 9,000 to China with 50,000. On top of this, Japan would also develop a dedicated fanbase, who would pass up the total score of the US despite having less players. The US would also grow considerably, but it had clearly taken much more of a hold in Asia. 2010 would be when a lot of the first famous players we think of today would start rising up the score rankings, with Wolf, Doomsday, and Hakurei Reimu all becoming frontrunners. The game was still not very competitive though, with background dim still not even being a feature. This didn't seem to hinder its growth though, since China and the US would double their player counts to 100,000 and 80,000 respectively. The game had grown a huge amount, but it was still yet to hit its true stride, and it was crucially lacking the competitive aspects and one other key thing that would end up helping it greatly. 2011 and 2012 would see much of the same growth, but still not much in comparison to now, mostly because it still hadn't managed to get much of a grip anywhere besides Asia, because apart from the US, who still only had the 4th most players, all of the other top 5 countries were in Asia. And overall, both years were pretty mundane and didn't see any super major overhauls to gameplay. But there was one big thing that happened. The implementation of PP. Yep, there it was, the beginning of the end. But although PPV2 is a bit odd, PPV1 was sort of just busted. It wouldn't have been all too different from today, just the same system with a bit worse execution, except for the fact that they added map contention as a factor. This meant that if a map like the Big Black had 100 plays, and a 3-star map had 200,000, the 3-star would be extremely overrated, and maybe be even worth more than the Big Black. Scores would also decay in PP, which is actually a pretty interesting idea. Basically, over a year, scores would lose some of their value, which made the leaderboard stay fresh, but it also added to the unrepresentativeness of PPV1. But despite this, it was still a cool way of rating players that hadn't been seen much before in rhythm games, and the player base would change a fair bit because of it, becoming more competitive and having more maps that pushed the limits of what was seen as difficult, with maps like the Big Black being ranked. But in this way, the game's player base had sort of evolved ahead of the game's development, since it was still lacking crucial features like background dim, and it also had a busted star rating system, which capped out at 5 stars, and also had a lot of trouble rating maps, with things that are basically 3 stars today almost meeting the 5-star threshold, which basically meant that in the worst circumstances, you could have an 8-star map that has the same star rating and is worth less PP than a 4-star. 2013 was one of the biggest years in the game's history, since Background Dim, the new default skin without opaque 100s, and a much better editor would all be added, and the super ugly sliders that a lot of old maps had would be completely removed. It would also be one of the best years for the growth of the game, with the player base going from 1 million to nearly 5 million, quintupling the amount of players, with extreme growth pretty much everywhere, probably in large part due to places like the CSGO community playing as an aim trainer. This was also when PPV2 was implemented, and we all know how that went, but it was still a big step for the game, and it at least came fairly close to representing a few skills. There was still a lot of work to be done though, with star rating still being completely busted, and slider end still being required in skins. And most appallingly, if you didn't already have the setting on, you couldn't turn off a map's hit sounds or change the settings of a map until you'd passed it at least once. And on top of this, most maps still looked very archaic in comparison to today, despite some big advances being made in maps like RLC's Pretender. And so overall, the game still had a lot of work to be done, which is why 2014 and 2015 would be such big years. 2014 was the year Osu starts to look more like itself, with the default skin becoming more similar to today, and gameplay looking virtually the same, with slider ends finally becoming deliberately removable and cutting edge, and star rating finally becoming representative of difficulty. Steady growth of the game would also continue, with it reaching 7 million users by the end of 2015, and the US nearly doubling its members and taking China's spot as the country with the most players, making most of the growth in these years probably in the West. And there are a few reasons for this, most notably PewDiePie's video, which almost certainly helped the game, amassing 4.7 million views from people who almost certainly had never heard of the game before that point. The competitive scene would also begin to become more prevalent, with Kakizi's unban and the race for the first 600. Mapping would also start to become a whole lot more similar to today, with most maps losing their dependence on distance snap, and maps like Hanser's Miss You pushing the limits of what had been seen before in some pretty cool and creative ways. All of this was pretty big for the game, which had now become pretty similar to what it is today, but there was still more to be done. Most of the changes that would happen in 2016 and 17 would be community-based, with mapping becoming nearly indistinguishable from today, and a very successful Aspire. There would also be some massive events, like Kakizi's Freedom Dive FC, which now has over 2.5 million views. And 2017 would see the game sort of complete its arc, since well after this, there'd be small bug fixes and changes to the game. It was pretty much complete, and it also amassed a huge player base, now having 10 out of the 15 million players it would eventually amass. Things like skinning and content creation would continue to evolve, but the game itself was basically done. These are the years after the general completion of the game, when the community had time to become incredibly good, and farm maps also advanced a lot, with most of the biggest changes from this time actually being rebalances that nerfed space streams and made square jumps overrated. But although stable was barely changed over these years, there was one major thing left being developed: Laser. The sort of Osu 2, which is a complete redo of all the code in the game, which had sort of become a jumbled mess of 2007, 2013, and 14 code. And when it comes out, a lot is going to change, since despite being more complicated, Laser already runs much faster than stable, and with new features, and an easy to update engine, it's going to be huge when it comes out. In 2018? Oh wait, no, definitely 2019. 2020? Maybe, but Laser is a pretty massive project, and with how many delays we've seen, the best estimate is probably sometime in 2021. But when that happens, it's gonna be huge, and we might even get to see some of the game's legends come back just to give it a try. Osu was never destined to become as massive as it is currently. It started out with a fairly mundane goal and a small player base, but since that point, the game has pretty much gone through a complete evolution, with its own map ecosystem and styles, and players who've gone so far beyond what was originally intended that the game is basically unrecognizable from what it was just a few years ago. And through this, the game has grown to be what is pretty much the biggest rhythm game in the world. And I think that's pretty sick.